Predictors of dissatisfaction and divorce. One way to understand unhappy romantic relationships is to ask whether certain kinds of people or specific circumstances make marital dissatisfaction or divorce more likely. Does the kind of person you marry matter? What about the social class or age of the two people? To answer these questions, researchers relate measures of marital satisfaction to measures of personality and background. They have learned first that personality matters. Neurotic people, who tend to be anxious, tense, emotionally volatile, and melancholy, have less happy romantic relationships and are more likely to divorce. Similarly, people with low self-esteem and people who are highly sensitive to rejection have greater difficulties in intimate relationships. Moreover, romantic partners and friends who are sensitive to rejection respond with greater hostility when feeling rejected by intimate others. This hostility is often directed at others, but may be directed at the self as well. Certain demographic factors also predict problems in romantic relationships. Most notably, individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to divorce. Socioeconomic status, SES, refers to a combination of educational background, income, and occupational prestige. Low SES is apt to introduce into the relationship financial difficulties and the burdens of finding gratifying and stable work, some of the primary reasons that marriages break up. In terms of the age of couples, people who marry at a younger age are more likely to divorce. Of several possible explanations for this finding, here are two. Younger people may not be as effective at being long-term committed partners, and people who marry young may not be as successful at choosing the right partners. The four most harmful behaviors. As romantic partnerships mature, they revolve more and more around conversations and emotional exchanges about children, finances, and intimacy. Are there certain patterns of communication that indicate a relationship is in trouble? John Gottman and Robert Levinson pioneered an approach to study this question, one that identifies the specific emotions and patterns of communication that predict dissatisfaction and, ultimately, the termination of heterosexual, gay, and lesbian relationships. Gottman and Levinson videotaped married couples engaged in intense conversations in the laboratory and then studied the videos carefully for clues to romantic dissatisfaction. In a conflict discussion task, partners talked for 15 minutes about an issue they both recognized as a source of intense conflict in their relationship, and they tried their best to resolve it. The researchers studied those interactions and coded them for anger, criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, resisting dealing with problems, contempt, sadness, and fear, as well as several positive behaviors, including affection, enthusiasm, interest, and humor. In one long-term study using these techniques, Gottman and Levinson followed the marriages of 79 couples from one city over many years. Based on their observations, they identified the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that is, the four negative behaviors that are most harmful to relationships: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. Harmful relationship behaviors. The conversational behavior of the romantic couple pictured here suggests that the couple may be dissatisfied with their relationship. So he has his hands out in like a questioning gesture on the passion plane, and she's looking away from him with her hand on her, like her head on her hand. The researchers found, just as you would expect, that married individuals who continually criticize and find fault with their partners have less satisfying marriages. The same is true of people who are prone to stonewalling and avoidance. Romantic partners are also in trouble when they are unable to talk openly and freely about their difficulties without getting defensive, refusing to consider the possibility that something they are doing might contribute to the conflict. In contrast, the more couples disclose to each other about how they are feeling, the better it is for their relationship. And finally, contempt, the emotion felt by one person looking down on another, is particularly toxic to maintaining romantic bonds. Figure 10.8 shows how frequently couples were observed to express contempt and whether they stayed together or eventually got divorced. The couples who eventually divorced expressed more than twice as much contempt as the couples who stayed together. Figure 10.8, contempt and marital dissatisfaction. In this study, married partners who expressed contempt in a brief conversation about a source of conflict were more likely to be divorced 14 years later, compared with couples who exhibited less contempt. Feeling contempt is clearly toxic for a relationship. Frequency of contempt expression shown in a 15-minute conversation. Okay, so there's two sets of bars in this bar graph, and they're colored by wife and husband, and the two categories on the x-axis are still together or divorced. So you can see if they're still together, the wife expresses less contempt than the divorced, and the man also expresses less contempt, almost twice as much less. It's interesting, though. You can see women express like half the amount of contempt that the husbands do in both situations, whether still married or divorced. Gottman and Levinson studies are susceptible to the problem of self-selection mentioned earlier. Without being able to select participants for each condition, it is difficult to tell which variable is caused by the other. Do married couples get divorced because they express contempt and other negative emotions, or do they express these emotions because their relationship is already on rocky ground? Additional findings by Gottman and Levinson indicate the former, that negative communication patterns may in fact contribute directly to divorce. In another study of the 79 couples mentioned earlier, the researchers used measures of the four toxic behaviors: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt early in the relationship to predict who would stay together and who would be divorced 14 years later. Remarkably, based on these four measures gathered from a 15-minute conversation, they could predict with 93% accuracy who would get divorced. Box 10.6, not so fast. Critical thinking about the variable being measured. Most newlyweds are happy with each other. However, as the harsh reality of a 50% divorce rate shows, many don't stay that way. Is there any way to predict which couples are likely to thrive over the long term and which ones are headed for trouble? If so, would it be better to ask the newlyweds directly what they think of each other, or would an indirect, implicit measure be better? To find out, a group of investigators asked 135 newlywed couples to rate their relationship on a number of scales, such as good, bad, and satisfied, dissatisfied. They also administered an implicit measure of how much the partners liked each other by flashing a picture of their partner very briefly, a third of a second, before showing them pictures of positive and negative items, such as flowers and spiders. The participants indicated as quickly as possible whether the items pictured were positive or negative, and the investigators used the extent to which their partner's photo sped up participants' responses to the positive words and slowed down their responses to the negative words as an indirect measure of how much they liked their partner. The investigators then checked in with the newlyweds every 6 months for the next 4 years and asked how satisfied they were with their relationship. The indirect measure did a very good job of predicting relationship satisfaction down the road. The more positive they felt about each other as newlyweds, by that measure, the more satisfied they were 4 years later. The explicit measure was worthless. Participants' conscious assessments of how good, bad, or satisfied, unsatisfied they felt about their relationship as newlyweds was not related to how they felt down the road. It seems that people's automatic, non-conscious attitudes can reveal a lot about what's really going on inside, but explicit assessments don't really reveal anything. As the investigators put it in the title of their paper, though they may be unaware, newlyweds implicitly know whether their marriage will be satisfying. Not so fast. Things aren't always as they seem, and the phrase, may be unaware, is a telling hedge. What this study shows is that this particular measure of the newlyweds' explicit attitudes are a poor predictor of the course of their relationship. It doesn't mean their explicit attitudes generally are a poor predictor. Maybe this measure doesn't really capture their explicit attitudes. After all, if you had concerns about the person with whom you just tied the knot, I worry about his drinking, is she going to end up looking like her mother? You might be unwilling to express that in a survey, and maybe that's why the explicit measure didn't predict subsequent relationship satisfaction. The broader point here is that we are fundamentally interested in the relationship between variables, sexual orientation and self-esteem, for instance, but we are restricted to working with measures of those variables: what someone says about their sexual orientation, the size of a person's signature. We can get into trouble and draw the wrong conclusion when we confuse a variable with just one measure of that variable. Dangerous attributions. Certain construal tendencies, the way we interpret things, are also related to the weakening of romantic bonds. One of these tendencies is blame. Bradbury, Carney, and their colleagues have looked at the relationship between romantic partners' causal attributions, what they tend to attribute events and behaviors to, and their relationship satisfaction. These researchers have found that dissatisfied, distressed couples make attributions that cast their partner and their relationship in a negative light. That is, they attribute rewarding positive events in their relationships to unstable causes that are specific, unintended, and selfish. For example, distressed partners might interpret an unexpected gift of flowers as the result of a whim particular to that day, and anticipate the gift to be followed by some selfish request from their partners. Happier couples, on the other hand, tend to attribute the same positive events to stable causes that are general, intended, and selfless. A satisfied romantic partner thus might attribute a gift of flowers to her partner's enduring kindness. Similarly, happier partners attribute negative events, the forgotten anniversary or sarcastic comment, to specific and unintended causes, whereas distressed partners attribute the same kinds of negative events to stable and global causes and see their partners as blameworthy and selfish. Creating stronger romantic bonds. Now that we've identified some of the most common trouble spots in relationships, let's turn to the kinds of things you might do to build healthier romantic bonds. As you can gather from the previous discussion, you might be wise to avoid highly anxious, rejection-sensitive, neurotic individuals when choosing a partner, to minimize criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt in your interactions, and to try to interpret your partner's actions in a praiseworthy fashion. Social psychologists have begun to make progress in identifying other things that may contribute to healthier romantic relationships. A baby is an inestimable blessing and bother, Mark Twain. Capitalizing on the good. Are there healthy patterns of conversation that foster more satisfying bonds? Shelley Gable and her colleagues believe it's particularly important to capitalize on the good, to share what's good in your life with your partner, and to engage with the other's good news. In their research, these investigators found that individuals reported greater relationship satisfaction if they tended to receive active, constructive capitalization from their significant others when their partners responded to their good news with engaged enthusiasm. For example, at the news of a partner's forthcoming art show, the actively constructive partner might ask questions about what pieces to show and whom to invite, questions that reveal an active engagement in such an important development in the partner's life. Laughter is more important than tears, Toni Morrison. Being playful. Courtship and the early phases of a relationship involve unusual levels of fun: late-night dancing, candlelit exchanges of poetry, weekend getaways, and other exhilarating activities. The later stages, especially when children are involved, become focused on less inherently enjoyable activities: diaper changing, house cleaning, bill paying, and chauffeuring children to soccer practice. It's not surprising that having children, while bringing many joys, typically leads to a drop in romantic satisfaction. In fact, married partners typically don't return to their previous level of satisfaction until the children leave home. This point is nicely made in an exchange between a priest, a rabbi, and a minister on when life begins. The priest says at conception, the rabbi says at birth, and the minister says when the dog dies and the last child goes away to college. Keeping an element of playfulness alive in a relationship can help. Experimental work by Art Aaron and his colleagues attest to the benefits of a bit of exhilarating silliness in a marriage. In their study, spouses who had been married for several years engaged in one of two tasks. In a playfully arousing condition, partners were tied together at the knees and wrists with Velcro straps, and they were required to move a soft ball position between their heads across a long mat. In the other condition, each partner had to push a ball alone to the middle of the mat with a stick. Spouses reported significantly higher marital satisfaction after engaging in the novel, amusing joint task compared with participants in the other condition and with a baseline assessed earlier. Unusual, playful activities are fun and exciting, and spouses often misattribute their excitement about the activities to their feelings about their partner, thereby enhancing both partners' satisfaction with the relationship. Laughter often comes with play, and research suggests that shared laughter also bodes well for relationship well-being. Keys to good relationships. A. Shared laughter and play are vital to healthy relationships. B. Open communication and disclosure during conflicts are more helpful than stonewalling. Love to faults is always blind, always is to joy inclined, lawless, winged, and unconfined, and breaks all chains from every mind. William Blake. Looking on the bright side. Sandra Murray and her colleagues suggest that a tendency to idealize one's romantic partner is another important ingredient in a satisfying intimate bond. In one study, married couples and dating partners rated themselves and their partners on 21 traits related to virtues, such as being understanding and patient, desirable attributes within romantic relationships, such as being easygoing and witty, and faults, such as being critical or distant. The researchers compared the participants' rating of their partner's virtues and faults with their ratings of their satisfaction in the relationship. Those who idealized their romantic partners, that is, rated their partners higher on positive traits than the partners did themselves, were more satisfied with their relationships. Individuals also reported greater relationship satisfaction when their partners idealized them. A different research team examined heterosexual cohabiting couples and lesbian, gay, and heterosexual married couples and found that for all 4 types of couples, viewing one's romantic partner in an idealized fashion was linked to greater satisfaction with the relationship. In other studies, investigators have explored precisely how people idealize their romantic partners. In one case, people were asked to write about their partner's greatest fault. Satisfied partners were more likely to engage in 2 forms of idealization. First, they were more apt to see virtue in their partner's faults. For example, an individual might write that the partner was melancholy, but that the melancholy quality gave the partner a depth of character that was incomparably rewarding. Second, satisfied partners were more likely to offer yes, but refutations of the fault. For instance, a satisfied individual might write that the partner didn't like to hold down a steady job, but at least that gave the partner more time to help out at home. For a possible neuroscientific explanation, see Box 10.7. Box 10.7, Focus on Neuroscience. This is your brain in love. As the work of Sandra Murray and her colleagues suggests, the mind does amazing things when in love, turning faults into charming idiosyncrasies. For example, what does your brain do during love? Recently, neuroscientists and relationship researchers have joined forces to answer this question, and their answers are both intuitive and surprising. In these studies, fMRI images record the brain's pattern of activation while a person looks at a picture of a romantic partner or is in the throes of feeling intense love. Not surprisingly, these neuroimaging methods reveal that romantic love is associated with activation in reward regions of the brain, the ventral striatum, regions rich with receptors for oxytocin, which promotes trust and love, see Chapter 6, and dopamine, which promotes approach-related behavior. What may surprise you, though, is that romantic love also deactivates the amygdala, a region of the brain associated with the perception of threat. It appears that in the throes of love, the brain disables your ability to see what is threatening or dangerous about the new love. This finding may help your parents understand why you might fall in love with someone who doesn't quite live up to their standards. Your brain simply isn't reacting to potential signs of risk in your new love. The fondness for motorcycles, the disregard for conventional society. These findings also shed light on what the brain might be doing as you turn your partner's faults and flaws, which in others might activate the amygdala, into pleasing virtues, as the Murray team found. Love and marriage across cultures. To a degree that can be hard for modern Westerners to comprehend, some of our generalizations about love and marriage don't apply to most of the world's cultures, nor did they even apply to most Western cultures until relatively recently. Although romantic love seems to exist in almost every culture, it has generally not been regarded as a prerequisite to marriage. The more typical pattern is a marriage arranged by parents. A young man's parents and a young woman's parents come to an agreement about the suitability of the pair for each other, and they announce the marriage transaction to their children. Just like it sounds, the term transaction often applies in a very economic sense. The prospective bride's parents provide a dowry, or, somewhat less often, the groom's parents pay a bride price. These sorts of transactions are common today in much of Southeast and Southeast Asia and in much of Africa. Arranged marriages avoid some of the pitfalls of marrying for romantic love, including mismatches between the couple's socioeconomic status and religion, two factors associated with relatively high rates of divorce. In an arranged marriage, the in-laws are more apt to be respectful of one another, a stance perhaps less common when the in-laws, usually having not known each other previously, are brought together for reasons having nothing to do with mutual regard or existing respect for one another's families. Finally, the lack of expectation that there should be romantic love in the first place avoids the natural gradual transformation of romantic into a more companionate form of love that can serve as a source of disappointment and discontent. Looking back, love comes in different varieties, and the kind of love experienced in romantic relationships is just one of these. One's commitment to a relationship is influenced by how satisfying the relationship is, the relative absence or poor quality of alternative partners, and one's investments in the relationship. Personality and demographic factors predict unhappiness in marriage, as do toxic behaviors like criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, contempt, and blame. Research on relationships by social psychologists is yielding important insights about successful and rewarding relationships in which partners capitalize on the good, choose to be playful, and see each other in a flattering light. Chapter Review Summary. Characterizing relationships. The need to belong is biologically based, as evident in the evolutionary benefits and universality of human relationships and the negative consequences that result from their absence. In long-term communal relationships, people feel responsible for each other. In short-term exchange relationships, people are concerned with equity and reciprocity. Social exchange theory is based on the idea that how people feel about a relationship depends on their assessments of its costs and rewards and what they believe alternative relationships can offer. According to attachment theory, early attachments with parents and other caregivers shape relationships for a person's whole life. The two dimensions of attachment are anxiety, fear of rejection, and avoidance, discomfort with intimacy. Attachment style is relatively stable and has wide-ranging effects on a person's well-being throughout life. Attraction. Proximity, the sheer closeness of contact, leads to attraction and liking. Liking can be influenced by the functional distance created by the architectural layout of a living arrangement that encourages social contact. This is partly explained by the mere exposure effect, the tendency to like a stimulus the more frequently it is encountered. Similarity influences attraction because people like others who resemble them in their class background, recreational preferences, and core values and beliefs. There is little evidence that opposites attract, except when one partner's needs can be fulfilled by the other's difference. Physically attractive people are more popular with the opposite sex, earn more money, and receive lighter sentences for crimes. Because of the halo effect, they are believed to have many positive qualities that go beyond their physical appearance. Physical appearance affects the lives of women more than men. Reproductive fitness is the capacity to pass one's genes on to future generations, and people seek mates with characteristics, such as the ability to resist disease, that enhance the likelihood of reproductive success. Evolutionary psychologists believe that parental investment leads men to prefer women whose physical appearance indicates they will be fertile, and leads women to be attracted to men who can provide for them and their children. Romantic relationships. Romantic relationships, an important part of social life, are essential for well-being and physical health. There are many kinds of love, including companionate love, compassionate love, and romantic love. According to the investment model of commitment, 3 determinants make partners more committed to each other: satisfaction, few alternative partners, and investments in the relationship. Commitment is linked to longer-lasting relationships because it increases relationship-promoting behaviors such as forgiveness and self-sacrifice. Predictors of relationship dissatisfaction and divorce include disparities in personality and socioeconomic status, marrying too young, communication issues, and behavioral problems such as criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, contempt, and blame. In healthy relationships, couples work on strengthening their bond by capitalizing on the good events in their lives, being playful, and looking on the bright side by seeing each other's positive attributes. In many cultures around the world, marriages are arranged by the parents, which may have some advantages that Westerners don't generally realize.